Half a century ago, on January 20, 1973, Amílcar Cabral, a prominent anti-colonial revolutionary and political leader from Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, was shot and killed outside his home in Conakry, the capital city of Guinea, by political rivals and agents of colonialism, allegedly supported by the Portuguese colonial government.
Our fight is only against the Portuguese colonialism, the foreign domination in our country.
Now, Cabral did not only lead the War of Independence that toppled the Portuguese rule in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, but he also influenced the fight for decolonization across the whole continent of Africa. But despite his significant role and contributions to the liberation struggle in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, Cabral is less widely known than other African political leaders or even mentioned in many history books. So in this video, Africa is not in Hollywood, we'll be talking about one of Africa's foremost anti-colonial leaders and Pan-Africanist, Amílcar Cabral. His life, who he was, his struggle, his assassination, and who was allegedly behind it. So get ready for another story about another African hero that will challenge the one-sided narratives the West has historically portrayed about Africa. So, who exactly is this hero, Amílcar Cabral? Amílcar Lopes da Costa Cabral was born on September 12, 1924 in Bafata, Portuguese Guinea, now known as Guinea-Bissau. His parents, Juvenal Antonio Lopes da Costa Cabral and Eva Pinel Evora, were both from the island of Santiago in Cape Verde. His father was from a wealthy family. His mother, on the other hand, was a shop owner and a hotel worker. Amílcar Cabral received his secondary education at Lycée Gilles Enes in Cape Verde and later studied agronomy and economics at the Instituto Superior de Agronomia in Lisbon, Portugal. During his time as an agronomy student in Lisbon, he founded student movements aimed at challenging Portugal's ruling dictatorship and advocating for the independence of African Portuguese colonies. But before I continue, allow me to describe the environment in which Amílcar Cabral was born. Cabral was born and raised in Portuguese Guinea, a country, as you can guess by its name, was under Portuguese colonial rule, but today it's known as Guinea-Bissau. For over 500 years, the Portuguese ruthlessly exploited Portuguese Guinea, starting in 1446 with the empire's hunt for slaves and gold. Now, after centuries of brutal oppression, exploitation, and enslavement, Portuguese Guinea became a poverty-stricken nation. Portugal exploited the colony's natural resources, particularly cashew nuts, timber, and fish. Now, Portuguese Guinea was also used as a source of forced labor, with many Guineans being forced to work on Portuguese-owned plantations. Portugal also used Portuguese Guinea as a strategic base for its slave trade until the mid-19th century. The colony served as a major hub for the transatlantic slave trade, with thousands of African slaves being transported to the Americas and Europe from its port. In addition to exploiting the colony's resources and people, Portugal also used Portuguese Guinea as a battleground in its war against African nationalist movements in modern-day Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique, among others. Portugal ipso facto denied the possibility of self-rule to the Guineans categorically, let alone becoming fully independent, and was committed to retaining control over the area at any expense. They decided not to give the Portuguese Guinea independence at all. Like in other Portuguese colonies, the African population experienced minimal progress under Portuguese rule. The situation was bad, with only one doctor per 100,000 Africans and a mere 300 hospital beds, mostly located in the capital, Bissau. The shortage of nurses and midwives worsened the situation even more. In terms of education, the literacy rate was extremely low, with only 1% of the population being able to read and write. The only government secondary school had a majority of European students, making the situation even more challenging. However, by 1960, there were a total of 14 African graduates who were recognized as assimilated Portuguese citizens. These assimilated Portuguese, or assimilados as they were referred to, were African subjects of the Portuguese colonial empire who had met the Portuguese legal standards for citizenship and were considered fully entitled to their rights as Portuguese citizens. Amílcar Cabral was one of them. He was selected by the colonial rulers of Portuguese Guinea to receive university training in Lisbon due to his intelligence and a combination of hard work and good fortune. While in Lisbon, Amílcar Cabral founded student movements dedicated to opposing the ruling dictatorship of Portugal and promoting the cause of independence for the Portuguese colonies in Africa. He was also one of the founding members of an association of Lusophone African students, Movimento Popular Libertação de Angola, MPLA, together with Agostinho Neto, who would later become the first president of Angola, and other Angolan nationalists. After graduating in 1950, Cabral returned to Africa and was employed by the Portuguese colonial authorities as an agronomist. In the early 1950s, he traveled widely in Portuguese Guinea to survey the land and its resources, and this allowed him to interact with people from various cultures who lived within the colony. So this is a summary of the Guinea Amílcar Cabral was born into, the Guinea Amílcar Cabral grew up in. Now moving forward, in 1954, Cabral was already an important political figure in Portuguese Guinea. So in response to his growing influence in the anti-colonial movement, he was exiled to Angola with permission to visit his family once a year. Permission to visit his own country of birth. Now, as a graduate agronomist, he could have settled comfortably into the colonial services as a successful assimilado. But Cabral wasn't satisfied with the status quo. He knew Portugal would never move beyond the assimilado window dressing to grant Africans in Portuguese Guinea the right to self-determination and independence. So during one of his visits to the country on September 19, 1956, Cabral and 5 other Cape Verdean activists, including his half-brother, Luis Cabral, Aristides Pereira, who would later become the first president of Cape Verde, Fernando Fortes, Julio Almeida, and Eliseu Turpin. Together, they founded the Partido Africano para a Independencia da Guiné e Cabo Verde, PAIGC, or in English, African Party for Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde. The PAIGC was initially a peaceful movement that advocated for independence through non-violent means. But one horrific event changed that forever: the Pichiguti Massacre. The Pichiguti Massacre was an incident that took place on August 3, 1959 at the port of Bissau's Pichiguti docks in Bissau, Portuguese Guinea. Now, dock workers went on strike seeking higher pay, but the manager, Antonio Carreira, called the International and State Defense Police, the Portuguese state police that were popularly called PIDE, P-I-D-E, and the PIDE opened fire into the crowd and even throwing grenades. They killed at least 50 people, but some sources said 25. But over 100 people were injured. Now, instead of bringing the offenders to book, the colonial government blamed the revolutionary group PAIGC, arresting several of its members. Now, these incidents caused the PAIGC to abandon their campaign of non-violent resistance. So, Amílcar Cabral returned to Bissau from Angola. But it is important to note that the Pijuguti massacre was a key turning point in the PAIGC's decision to engage in armed struggle. Cabral understood that the massacre, which involved killing dozens of unarmed dock workers protesting against poor working conditions, clearly demonstrated the Portuguese colonial government's willingness to use violence to maintain control. So the PAIGC declared war. At first, the Portuguese tried to hold on to the colony at all costs by burning villages, mass arrests, torture, and even more killings. But their violent repression inspired more resistance and guerrilla warfare. Amílcar Cabral vowed that Africans would never beg for freedom. So, in 1963, the War of Independence was launched. Now, Cabral established training camps in Ghana with the permission of Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah helped Cabral to prepare men for the independence war. He trained his lieutenants through various techniques, including mock conversation, to equip them with effective communication skills, to mobilize Guinean traditional leaders supporting the PAIGC. Meanwhile, Cape Verde and Portuguese Guinea had strong connections, and as the war in Guinea-Bissau, that is the Portuguese Guinea, intensified, the Portuguese cracked down harder on the nationalist activities in Cape Verde. Despite facing opposition from the Portuguese, the PAIGC received significant support from the people of the islands in their efforts to establish an independent government with Guinea-Bissau. However, the Portuguese were not going to let this go down without a fight. So, in 1968, Portuguese President Américo Thomas visited Portuguese Guinea and declared that the country would remain an integral part of their national territory. Now, this visit marked a turning point in the war. Pay attention. In May of the same year, General Antonio de Spinola was made the Governor General of the territory. Now, as Governor General, Spinola attempted to address the grievances of the local population and to improve their living conditions by building schools and all that. However, he also pursued a military strategy against the PAIGC. Now, despite Spinola's efforts, the PAIGC continued to gain ground in the struggle for independence, and the Portuguese military was unable to defeat them. Now, Spinola opened 160 schools in strategic villages and made promises to the opponents of the PAIGC, divide and rule. However, by 1969, the PAIGC claimed to control 2/3 of Guinea's area and 45% of the population. General de Spinola, desperate to stabilize the military front for the Portuguese forces, authorized different operations, even such as the Operation Green Sea on November 22, 1970, as an attempt to assassinate Ahmed Sékou Touré, the then president of neighboring Guinea, and Amílcar Cabral, who was living at the PAIGC's headquarters in Conakry. General de Spinola authorized the operation as part of his broader strategy to defeat the PAIGC and maintain Portuguese control over the territory. Spinola believed that a successful military operation would demonstrate Portuguese military strength and weaken the PAIGC's position. However, the operation ultimately failed to achieve its objective. The Portuguese military encountered strong resistance from the PAIGC, and the operation resulted in significant casualties on both sides. After the failure of capturing Cabral during Operation Green Sea, the Portuguese started using agents within the PAIGC to try to remove him. Now, on January 20, 1970, a disgruntled former associate, Inocêncio Cani, together with another member of the PAIGC, shot and killed Amílcar Cabral in Conakry.
Amílcar Cabral,
The possible plan was to arrest Cabral, possibly to judge him summarily later. But facing the peaceful resistance, they immediately killed him. Now, according to Amílcar Cabral's wife, who was with him when he was assassinated, Inocêncio Cani and the other assailants came to Cabral and tried to tie him up. Cabral said, and I quote, "You can't tie me. This is why we have been fighting. No one ties me," end quote. Those were the last words of a true hero before he was shot multiple times in the head. Now, the assassination happened less than 15 months before the end of the war, because in 1972, Cabral had already begun to form People's Assembly in preparation for the independence of Guinea-Bissau before he was killed. Some theories suggest that Cabral's assassination was part of a broader attempt to establish a PAIGC leadership that was more conciliatory towards the Portuguese. On September 24, 1973, the PAIGC declared the independence of Guinea-Bissau, and the country was recognized by the United Nations and many other countries around the world. Then, Luis Cabral, Amílcar Cabral's half-brother, became the first president of Guinea-Bissau. Portugal finally recognized Guinea-Bissau's independence on September 10, 1974, and by the end of October, it had withdrawn all its military forces from Guinea-Bissau. It is important to note that during the Guinea-Bissau War of Independence, Amílcar Cabral and the PAIGC received support from various foreign countries and organizations. One of the primary sources of support for the PAIGC was the Soviet Union, which provided the movement with military and financial aid. The Soviet Union saw the struggle in Guinea-Bissau as part of a larger global struggle against colonialism and imperialism in Africa, and it provided the PAIGC with weapons, training, and other forms of assistance. Other countries that supported the PAIGC included Cuba, which sent military advisors and medical aid to injured fighters, and China, which provided the movement with military and financial assistance. Many African countries also supported the PAIGC, including Algeria, which served as a base for the PAIGC's operations, and Ghana, which provided financial assistance to the group. It was only in 1971, after nearly 10 years of fighting, did Portugal finally admit that a state of war existed in Portuguese Guinea, by which time 30,000 Portuguese troops were fighting 7,000 Guinean guerrillas. They hid this from the world. The killings, the exploitations, the rape, everything they tried to hide. But Amílcar Cabral and the PAIGC fought one of the most fierce wars in Africa history for the independence of the Portuguese Guinea. And today, Amílcar Cabral is one African hero who fought with the last drop of his blood for the liberation of Guinea-Bissau and Africa as a whole. A hero whose stories are not taught in schools or whose legacies we cannot read about in so many history books. But in case you didn't know, but now you know. Thanks a million for joining. Hope to see you next week with another story of another African hero. Thank you and see you next week.